Boom.
Boom.
Cheers to the water, apparently. But we're here with FLOAT.Calm co-founders, Leah and Brad, Winnipeg's largest flotation center at 337 Pembina Highway in Winnipeg, Manitoba, for all you listeners out there, and viewers on YouTube. And it's a place where you can disconnect to reconnect. That's something I read on your website and really enjoyed. Through flotation therapy and sensory deprivation. So maybe to start us off, what is floating and what got you interested in floating?
Yeah, for sure. Floating's interesting. It has a really colorful history. It's been around for over 60 years. It was originally created by a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist named Dr. John C. Lilly. So this goes back to 1955-ish era. And, that was kind of Cold War times. And there's, he was kind of, there was some different camps at the time of what this thing we call consciousness was. And some people thought that it was simply a manifestation of our interaction of our nervous system with the outside world. And that's kind of what makes us, have that person in our head that makes us conscious. And some people thought if you were to reduce that stimulus coming into our nervous system down to nothing or as close to nothing as possible, that you would actually you'd either go unconscious, you might fall asleep. Some people thought you would die and it would just completely shut your system down. And he's like, nah, no, don't think any of that stuff's going to happen. And so he was one of the first researchers to attempt to test this. And he was somebody who was very ethical kind of in his practice as a scientist, especially in his later years. And so he used himself as a guinea pig. He took an old Navy diving tank, one of those upright ones. I have pictures of this even. And he heated the water to what he calls skin receptor neutral. So it's about 94 roughly, or 93.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's warm, but it's below body temperature. And he took a diving bell, blacked it out, had his science partner make sure he was okay and getting air and all that. And he used himself and he went into this thing. He thought initially he was going to have a bit of a panic attack and maybe, freak out a little bit. And he actually very quickly found that he felt really calm, relaxed, euphoric, kind of started smiling and giggling to himself a little bit. And he was like, what the heck is going on? This is not what I expected happening. And from there on, he started studying what he termed as sensory deprivation. And it got a lot of press at the time, and there's a lot of really mixed information about it because some of the studies that they were doing on sensory deprivation at the time were really, they were really unorthodox. They would put you in a hospital bed and they would put cardboard tubes on your limbs and an eye mask on and strap you down. And the initial reactions were people were freaking out, obviously, and they weren't able to make it through a long duration in this state that they were in. When you think back on it, it's well, of course, these people, their free will is taken away. They literally can't move, and they're isolated, and they're not even really being deprived or in what we call it reducing of stimulation coming in because they got all this stuff around them. There's medical equipment around them. It's a very unrelaxing, serene kind of environment. And so this kind of got some of the bad press and bad stigmas. And then in around the mid 70s or so, John C. Lilly hooked up with an engineer named Glenn Perry and his wife, who are still around today and still very heavily involved in the float industry, and they're amazing, super sweet people that we've actually had the privilege to meet on a number of occasions. And he was an engineer, and so they devised the first float tank, and it was called the Samadhi tank, and that was using Epsom salt to create this really buoyant solution. Initially, it was just water. And so now we use, a very, very saturated solution of Epsom salt to create this buoyant environment, which is why it's called a float tank and why you can float without any effort. Still heated up to that same skin temperature. And then the float tank itself is created in a way that creates an environment that helps reduce stimulus coming into your nervous system. So that's kind of what floating is, and a little bit of, the history. It was studied scientifically all the way through the 80s. and in the 90s and even in the 2000s now, and there's some brand new research centers opening now who are really heavily involved in the scientific research fields of studying, sensory deprivation, or REST, as it's called in the science world. It stands for restricted environmental stimulation therapy, or stimulation technique, whichever one. And like I said, the purpose of a float tank is to reduce stimulus coming into your nervous system, and it does help you get into really deep states of relaxation or meditation with very little effort, or even knowledge of knowing how to meditate. It is kind of like meditation on training wheels in a lot of way for people, and they get to experience that because most people who try to meditate, they never get to the place that they read about in literature or articles about these people achieving these enlightened Zen states, and most people know they're never going to be a Buddhist monk, and so it's important that people can experience some of this, so they know it's not this woo-woo hippy-dippy type thing that only people who are living on a mountaintop in a monastery can achieve. It's something that everyday people can benefit from, and it really can enhance a lot of people's lives in different ways, for sure.
Yeah, that's our experience, I would say. I don't know, I can't speak for Jayse, but it was very similar to that. And I almost found that there was two ways that you could use a flotation tank, and even two ways. I did find it a meditative experience, and I've had some experience with that as well. Mm-hmm. But it seems that there's two sort of places that you can go. You can do the active meditation or sort of a passive meditation. So active being, and I find that I typically do this, where I let my thoughts go wherever they go. And then if I go on a tangent for too long, I'll bring myself back to my breath and just let that take over the experience. Mm-hmm. But I can see for the relaxation aspect, if you are focusing on your breathing, I think it's Shavasana, yogic style breathing, where you're just focusing on the breath, that it would help you let go and just be that stress release and feel that nothingness. So it was interesting to see that you could take it maybe different ways, even in that flotation tank too. So I did want to know also how you got started with FLOAT.Calm and what inspired that beginning as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Wait, sorry, is it FLOAT.Calm or FLOAT.Calm?
It is FLOAT.Calm.
Okay, because I thought it's a good play on words.
It's a good question. It is a play on words, and it is intentional. Some people call us FLOAT.Calm, and that's fine.
Some people just call us Float.
Some people just call us Float, and that's totally okay too. But FLOAT.Calm was a very intentional play on words. We understand that sometimes it can almost be confusing, especially when we list our website and it's FLOATCalm.com, and we have to spell it out CALM, and then people will mistag us on social media, and they'll tag float.com, which is like some manufacturer of like plane floats, like for taking off of water.
They get tagged in our stuff a lot.
They get tagged in our stuff a lot. They must be like, who the hell are these float like, what is this? This relaxation thing that we're getting tagged in.
I like it, though. It's a good play on words, and I thought it meant that way, but then people were saying to me, FLOAT.Calm, and there was like that pause in there. I was like, okay, maybe it is that way.
Yeah, no, it is definitely FLOAT.Calm, and it is a play on words. One of the kind of things that got us into doing this was that both of us come from a background of, I was in the technology world. I was a programmer for years. I was in healthcare technology, specifically cancer therapy, and working for a very big, really good company that wanted to really help people with their cancer treatment in a very literal way. And I got exposed to some things that kind of tainted my view of that world in a lot of ways. And it really was a internal struggle for me of I'm giving a very large portion of my time and my energy to this company and to this cause, that at the same time, on the other hand, I'm like, this really doesn't feel like we're not really helping people in the right way, where it's a very reactive approach to a very proactive kind of, it requires a really proactive approach. Taking care of yourself is not something you do after you're sick. it's something that you do before so that you can build sustainability in your life so that you can live the best kind of life that you want to live. And so that was really one of the big catalysts that kind of, for myself, got into it. And Leah has a very, very similar story as well.
Yeah, like I worked in the insurance world, group benefits and stuff like that. So we both come from, businesses that really pushed Western medicine. Not that we're against Western medicine by any means, a time and a place, but, we've always been more the people who take a holistic approach to life and to our health and all that kind of stuff. And so it started to, like he said, feel like a bit of a internal conflict in our hearts. Just, it wasn't feeding us. And we wanted to kind of do something different and do our own thing and help people. And that's where we found floating, and that's kind of what took us there. And we went to Minneapolis. We were going down there for a concert, and that's where we had our first float experience. So, we were going down there. We thought, let's see if we can find a place that has a float tank down there. So we did. We found this little wellness center, and they had a float tank in the basement, and they just had one. So it was like this 3-hour-long to-do. I went, he waited, he went, I waited. And we made this like mistake of going from the nothingness of floating to then going to the Mall of America, which,
Very opposite ends.
I know, which in hindsight was it was such a contrast that it was really interesting to pay attention to. So we came out and we felt fantastic. And, myself, I've always struggled, like I've grown up my whole life with a lot of tummy problems. And I just think we all carry our stress somewhere. Some people get headaches, some people get, whatever it is. And I've always carried my stress in my tummy. And I came out of my float that day and I had this overwhelming sense of calm in my stomach that I had never had before. And that's where I knew, like, I need to be doing this all the time. But yeah, we went to the Mall of America. And by nature, we're more shy, introverted people. And it was interesting to see how we were the rest of our day. And it was almost like we were magnets to people. We kept having people come up to us at stores, just having conversations with us, random strangers. And this woman actually came up to me and she said to me, "You have this glow about yourself." And I looked at Brad and I said, "What is going on? Like, we are charming today." Charming. And we just started having conversations about how this affected us on more than just a physical, relaxed level. There was a lot more going on. And that's where we started kind of like researching into the whole float industry and thinking about opening a float center in the city here. And one of the first things we did was there's an annual float conference every year. Up until now, it's always been in Portland. And so we signed up and went to that. And we thought, let's just kind of surround ourselves in this industry and see how it feels and how it fits for us and if this is the right way for us to kind of go. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did. And we've been here ever since.
Yeah. It was funny. Our very first float there in the basement of this little wellness center. The first experience I had after my float, it was a very odd setup. There was like the float tank in one room, and then you go through a door and you're in like a totally separate room, and the shower's in there. You have to shower. There's insane amounts of salt in the thing, and you want to shower before you go in a float tank as well, typically. And there's a toilet in there, which is very unusual. And then I come out of that room, I'm all wet and, just freshly dressed. And there's like a geriatric stretching class happening right outside my float tank room. And I'm like, I open the door and it's like probably 10 older people like doing the splits like right in my face. And I'm like, whoa.
You weren't expecting them.
This
They
is a
were not
lot.
expecting
Yeah,
them.
here's this like wet guy
of the float
who's like
experience.
who's got this weird
Glassy-eyed
glassy-eyed glow coming out, and then they're like, what the heck is going on? We were both very confused, but that first experience definitely impacted us in a really strong way, and like Leah said, we had to start researching this thing and what the heck it was. Initially, we thought, like, this is cool. Like, can we get one of these in our house?
Yeah.
That would
That's
be
the
nice.
dream.
Right? That's the dream. I think
the
we
dream.
still have that. And then we realized after looking into it a bit more and stuff and just what's involved in in it were like, oh, like we'd have to dedicate a room to this and basically rebuild the room so that
It was
the
kinda
room doesn't
trash
get
your house.
trashed.
Yeah.
That salt water is invasive and
For
it
sure,
will
yeah.
destroy any surface that's not prepared for it. So we definitely, so we went from there. We went to the Float conference in Portland, which was a phenomenal time. It was very small at the time. It was only a couple hundred people. And they did an amazing job just kind of fostering a community, and everybody was super warm and welcoming. Learned a lot about just what goes into actually starting a float center. We went to like a start your float center kind of workshop that the guys who run the conference put on. And from there, we came home and met with Manitoba Public Health, and we're like, this is what we want to do. And they're like, what the hell is a float tank? So I literally drew pictures and created like a little package for public health people with photos of float tanks, with how big they are, how much solution is in them, what the filter units look like, because they're concerned with public health, so they want to know how do you clean the solution and surfaces and all these things. So I did a whole bunch of documentation for them just so that we could educate them on what the heck this was. Because, and we always say this, like, floating is not new, but it's new to a lot of people. It's been around for a long time, and but a lot of people still don't even know about it. Like, the most, mainstream person that talks about it is like guys like Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
And that's we hear every now and then is, oh yeah, I heard about this from Joe Rogan or whatever. But it was a big educational process to go through that with public health, and thankfully, we came out it with a really good relationship with them, and were
Built
able
the guidelines
and
with
built and actually wrote the guidelines for safe float tank operation alongside them for Manitoba, so that not only we could open, but so that anybody who wanted to do this, that there was already some kind of baseline that you had to hit to make sure, because that's one of the barriers to just even getting into a float tank.
So you were the first in Manitoba then?
To open a commercial space. There was a couple people that had like float tanks in their basement kind of thing, but we were the first like commercial space open to the public that people could come into.
How long have you guys been open now?
Just over 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. It's gone by really quick.
Yeah.
So what was that process like, first opening up and then trying to get people to buy into floating and even educate the public on how this could be part of their self-care routines?
Yeah, education is a big part of what we do, and even to this day, because, like he said, it's not new, but it's new to a lot of people even still. And even after 4 years, and we go and we do different events in different ways that we've gone and done talks at Shaw and, like staff and Hydro for their staff and stuff like that, and just educating. And after 4 years, it's cool because we've started to see, kind of the gap close in where, even if someone's never floated before, they at least have heard of it or they know someone who has. Where in the beginning, people were like, what? And they would just give you this look like, you want me to do that? Can't I do that in my bathtub? And we still get that every once in a while. It's like, no, man, you can't do that in your bathtub.
You're not doing that in your bathtub. No, you're not going to put that much salt down your drain.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah, but and educating in and of itself has its own challenges because, the number one thing that we always get is, what if I'm claustrophobic? And I think it's kind of funny because if you actually look at the true stats, it's like 1% legit of the population is legitimately claustrophobic.
Yeah,
but as soon as you start talking about floating, it's like 90% of the people are claustrophobic.
Yeah.
And so, kind of helping people, unpack some of their own fears and understand them a little bit more and where it comes from and work through them. We're psychologists, sometimes we're therapists to people in a lot of ways. And people sometimes legitimately have fears going into new experiences, and I get that. And just helping them feel safe and comfortable about it.
Yeah, the claustrophobia thing is definitely one that comes up.
I like that you
A
guys
lot.
have there's a book I saw. I kind of just flipped through it. I kind of wanted to look up what the study was, but it's a book, that study, and it shows, and one of the things in there was the claustrophobia, and it was very small on that chart. and kind of goes up into some people having out of body experiences and hallucinations, and relaxation was a big one on there.
Yeah.
And then there's like paranoia. Those were like the very small ones though, at like the one end of the spectrum. So it's interesting that claustrophobia comes up first out of people's minds. That definitely came to my mind because I am claustrophobic. Mm-hmm. And when I did float, I thought about keeping the door open or putting the foam in between the door so that way it was a little bit open, but I didn't. I was like, hey, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go full in. And I felt fine. Honestly, the tank's big enough.
Yeah.
And even I'm a 6'5" guy. I'm a huge guy. And if I put my arms like all the way stretched out, I can touch both ends of the tank, but there's still lots of space, and I didn't feel like I was closed in a tiny space.
Yeah, and one of the things that, is really important for people to understand, and we do this a lot when we're at events and at expos, and we'll have people, like, we have a video playing, and it gives a tour of our space and stuff, so people can, like, kind of, like, gauge whether they even want to approach us from a distance. And so we get a lot of people who will, like, stand 20 feet away, just locked right in to our video, and you can just see the look in their face, and they're thinking, no way, man, like you are not getting me into this thing. But yet they will not move on. Like there's enough curiosity there that they're like, ugh, could I? And then we engage with them, and they're like, the first thing they say to us is, what if I'm claustrophobic? And we say, well, we have a lot of guests who say they're claustrophobic. One of the things that people need to understand about the float environment is that's what the float tank does. It creates an environment, and that environment is intended to reduce stimulus coming into your nervous system. And to do that, we have to maintain the solution temperature and the air temperature and the humidity level very precisely, so that when you're in there and you stop moving, you stop feeling that sensation of the environment coming in through your tactile sensations, and you feel almost as if you're kind of levitating. And so we don't put a lid on the float tank to freak people out. We put a lid on the float tank so that it helps control the air temperature, the humidity level, and it doesn't introduce any drafts or anything like that.
And then we can provide that consistent environment.
That's
and
right.
almost like the bigger the environment is, the more challenging it is to create that consistent environment. Then the bigger the area is of air, the harder it is to control that temperature of air. Then you start introducing complaints about people feeling a draft, or they're cold, or you just can't get that. Or
they're too cold, they're too hot because the heater kicks on and then it doesn't shut off in time. And so, like, we know from experience, literally a half or a quarter degree Fahrenheit, which is a very small fraction of a degree Celsius, affects how people perceive the environment in a really great way. We can have one person go in, we can have the same person go into a float tank at, say, 94 degrees, which is a comfortable temperature for most people. They will come out and say, it was really cool and it was cold. We can turn it up a half a degree or a quarter degree, and they'll come out and be like, oh, that was perfect. It is such a small amount.
It's a very finicky environment.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, and like to what you guys were saying too. Even our float tanks, like, they're not small. They're over 8.5 feet long, and they're 4.5 feet wide. The lid on them isn't like a tanning bed where it's in your face. There's enough space around you that I can.
That was the first thing I noticed. Is like I put my hand up, and like I had to put my hand all the way up to even touch the roof of it.
Exactly. And so I can crouch down and I can, like, walk inside the float tank. And I think people who have never seen one before in real life, they immediately go to that Simpsons episode where they're, like, in this little capsule and Homer gets shipped off to Mexico or whatever it is, and or they go to the tanning bed scenario, or an MRI machine. That's another one people get a lot. I know that my dad is super. He's had to have an MRI a couple times, and they have to sedate the guy. And it's like, he's not a fearful person, but there's certain trigger points. And so for people who have had those experiences in the past, it then becomes a trigger for them.
When it's almost ridiculous, actually, to compare the float experience to having an MRI, because MRI, first of all, you're not going there for good times.
No. Well, and it's a really closed space.
And
it's
it's a
very
real, and
close,
your free will is taken away.
Yeah.
You're not in control of your environment.
move at all.
Like everything about it is exactly the opposite of what we do. But people like to sometimes marry those things together, which is really unfortunate because then it's a lot harder for us to help them overcome that kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think also what's really important for people to know as well is that, when people come to see us for the first time, we're really intentional with giving everyone a really nice tour of our whole space and a really nice introduction in their float room and giving people different ways to work with their comfort zone. Like you said, if you are apprehensive, even about closing the door, different ways to leave it propped open. You could leave it all the way open, but then you risk introducing that draft, cooling the water, your body cooling, and that's no fun either, right? So making people aware that this is why, we recommend you close it, but work your way to it. And if you have apprehension about the darkness, we have little glow balls that people like to take in with them, like their little float buddies.
Nice.
And people love those. It's like almost having like your little glow in the dark rubber ducky with them. And it's interesting because, people take it in with them because it makes them feel better that they have it. 10 minutes in, they realize, actually I'm laying in here with my eyes closed anyways. And they put it together, but I think it's just helping them kind of overcome.
It's getting to that comfort level.
Exactly.
And that comfort zone. I think back to, for a long time, I wanted to try yoga, even through my teens. And it took till after I played football through university. So my body took a beating through that time. And then it was working in an office job and having back pain at 25 or 24. And went, let's do something proactive about this. And I always knew that I should be stretching more. I should be doing something self-care oriented to help this. And it took a long time to just get comfortable enough to, to be new at something. Knowing that I would be going in, yes, I'm athletic, but I knew stretching would be a very difficult and different task. So similarly, the float experience for people, it's getting to that point where maybe they're curious that 20 feet back, but once they get to know about it and know the benefits and know exactly what it entails and even know that you can bring a float ball in there or something or a glow-in-the-dark ball, that creates that comfort so that you can release into the experience and you can fully enjoy it too. So
At your own pace.
100% at your own pace.
And it's not like you're locked in there.
No.
Like, for those thinking of trying it and are scared of claustrophobia, if it does happen, you open the door.
Just open the door.
It's not like you're locked in. And then you're stuck in there for an hour and a half.
Harks back to the the early sensory deprivation experiences, and they associated sensory deprivation with this feeling of panic and people going crazy or mind control and stuff like that, and it's simply because they had their free will taken away. And same thing with an MRI. Your free will's gone. You're stuck in there. You are not allowed to move, or you're strapped down and you can't move. That's a very different experience.
And also knowing why you're there.
And also knowing why you're there, which is already anxiety inducing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, just for people to know, you're in total control. You want to get out anytime, you want to pop the door, go ahead. We are not, nobody's judging you but yourself. And it's with anything new in life that you're trying to challenge yourself with, sometimes the biggest, hardest things is just kind of making that first step and actually walking in the door kind of thing.
And speaking to your experience with yoga, people have to wait until they're ready. And I think this is the same thing with floating. You can't drag someone there kicking and screaming. It's not going to be a good time. And I remember I had a woman call and book in for her and her husband one time, and she was surprising him with the float. I guess he'd always been curious and interested, but she was surprising him with it. And I thought, oh, okay, that's a nice present, thinking that he would know when he's coming, at least when he's coming. But she walked him up to the building blindfolded. Oh. I'm like, you don't let someone get mentally prepared for their first float experience. I was like, bro, you're just
surprise.
You're setting this guy up. Don't do that.
He did awesome, though. He did awesome.
Yeah, it would take a while to come back down from the surprise and actually get comfortable enough to do it.
The other skeptical side I've heard from it after I've done it and I've told people about it, and they're like, oh, how long did you go? 30 minutes, 60 minutes? No, I was in there for 90 minutes. And that seems like such a long time. I feel like I'd get bored.
Yeah, totally.
And the craziest thing to me is I thought that too going in. And then the music came on and I was like, there's no way it's been 90 minutes. And I get out and look at my cell phone sitting on the side there. And it's been 90 minutes. It literally felt like 20 minutes I was in there at most.
It goes by so fast. And I think that's a hard thing to to explain to people, and you don't really know until you get your butt in that tank, right? When you get into that really deep, relaxed, meditative state, it goes by fast. And we have a lot of people now who come and do back-to-back sessions with us. They go in for 3 hours. We have a few people who consistently do triples, so they go in for 4.5. The longest we've had is a guy who came in and he did a 7.5-hour float with us.
Whoa.
But think about it, like, I know. I know.
We say too, this is not a competition. It's not like, let's see who can float the longest.
Competitive floating.
Competitive, yeah.
But I remember we were working that day when he came in, and he's a regular floater with us, and it wasn't his first time.
He's very intentional
With how he spends his time, and he was doing a lot of really intentional work, and which is why he did a long float that day. But we were working when he came in, and we were home that evening, and I was like, dude, that guy's still in the tank, man. It was like hours later. But yeah, think of it like when you go to sleep, when you wake up in the morning, it doesn't feel like 8 hours went by.
Right.
Yet it did.
Yeah, and it's not that you're falling asleep often. It's that
Although sometimes,
and that's another very common question that we get is, what if I fall asleep in there?
I've had great naps.
But you're getting into a different state of consciousness. You are getting into almost, I describe it kind of like a little bit of a dreamlike state. You know, when you're laying in bed at nighttime and you're falling asleep, oftentimes you'll have like these little brain waves of ideas or solutions to problems that you've been working on that come to you right before you fall asleep. And then you wake up in the morning and you're like, damn, what was that idea? That was really good. And it's hard to bring it back because you're in this different, your brain waves are changing. They're going into your sleep brain waves. But before then you hit this band, it's called the theta brainwave state. And that's this area that you can kind of get into when you're in a float tank. And it's also the area really, experienced meditators and stuff can get to and sustain. In a float tank, you can sustain that while staying fully conscious and aware of your thoughts without immediately falling into a sleeping state. And when you're in that kind of really relaxed state of consciousness, time doesn't pass normally. It's a hard thing to explain to people. Like, you can just verbalize and say it doesn't feel like 90 minutes. But to your point, like, majority of people who come out, they're like, whoa, like I felt like I was in there for half an hour.
Yeah. I feel like, my notion of time is not the same, especially considering I'm not bombarded by all these things that are constantly reminding me of the time. I don't have my watch. I don't have my phone. I don't have these messages constantly coming through. Mm-hmm. I don't have anything to kind of base time on anymore. It's just you and your thoughts, essentially.
Yeah. There's no exactly. You have no reference point.
Yeah.
Your reference points are kind of gone, and I think it's and also and this is something that happened to you your first float. You become aware of things when you're in the float tank. You become aware of where your mind will go when it's kind of left unhinged. And, for some people, they obsess about time. They're like, how long has it been? Do I have 10 minutes left? Do I have this? Do I have that?
That was me.
That was you.
And I was like, you guys, I do this all the time in the real world too. Holy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Time came up a couple of times in my mind just to go, it was almost a reference point. I went, how much longer do I have left? Because I knew I wanted to enjoy it, but then focusing on that too much, you would waste time and energy towards being like, how much time do I have left? So it was just allowing my brain to circle and come back and think of things and sort through problems. So I found it was nice to just sit there. And then there'd be those couple of times where I might touch the edge and just push off or like play with the water for a little bit too.
Totally.
So there was a little bit of that play element, but then there was also the focus on certain things in my own mind. So I did want to know as well, what the most effective way to use this as part of a self-care routine would be.
Yeah, before we touch on that, I just wanted to kind of maybe touch on why we do 90 minutes. And I think that that's important as well to talk about. Most of the studies that they do on floating, they pretty much always use 90 minutes as a benchmark. Every once in a while they'll use 1 hour, but they pretty much usually use 90 minutes. And for a few reasons. First of all, and especially your first time, it could take you 30 to 40 minutes sometimes just to get the heck out of your own head, right? And kind of struggling to get away from that monkey mind a little bit. So we want you to have that opportunity to get into that really relaxed place and then to stay there for a while and enjoy that, as opposed to you just get there and boom, you're out right away. So that's the reason why we do 90 minutes. And I think, 1 hours are okay. And I honestly feel like anything less than that is almost doing a disservice to the person. I don't want you to go in and just spend half an hour with your monkey mind and then get out and that's all you experienced. And then you're going to be like, well, that was no fun. Do you know what I mean? And also, like, if someone wants to get out a little bit early, that's okay too. Like, take what you need, leave the rest. But to speak to, I think you said your friend was like, what would I do? I feel like I would get bored.
Yeah.
We always say, like, if you don't want to spend 90 minutes with yourself, who the heck else is going to want to?
True, very true. You did mention some people going longer, up to over 7 hours in the tank.
Yeah.
Are there any detrimental effects of being in the Epsom salts for that long?
Some people ask, like, even for the 90 minutes, and this is very common when we're having face-to-face conversations, they'll say things like, oh my God, you must be so pruny when you come out. You know what I mean? Like your skin pruning up, like if you're in a bathtub or a swimming pool for a long time.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't, exactly. And because it's...
So that's one of the things I noticed coming out. I'm like, oh, I'm not...
You're not pruny at all.
Because usually the fingertips are the first place where you get pruny, right?
Exactly. And it's because there's such a high concentration of Epsom salt in there. There's literally there's very little water that's actually wicking into your skin to cause that pruning effect. You are getting benefits from the Epsom salt as well. Like Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate. Epsom salt is 10% magnesium. So you're literally floating in a solution that has over 80 pounds of magnesium in it. And so we actually have a few nutritionists that will send in their patients for magnesium supplementation when they do blood work or whatever, and they find out that they're low, because you can absorb magnesium easier through your skin than you can orally through your digestive tract. And this is why there's magnesium creams and ointments and sprays and all this stuff that are meant for topical use, because you can absorb it directly through your skin. And so you get kind of some of these side benefits of a super saturated concentration of Epsom salt, without having to, put 100 pounds of Epsom salt in your bathtub at home.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
But yeah, as far as other detriments to being in the environment that long, no.
No, not that we're aware of. I mean, we've known people, I think it's happened last year at the float conference. There's a buddy of ours that went for an overnight float while he was at the float conference. And he's like, yeah, it wasn't the best idea. He was super tired because he didn't sleep very much in the tank. And his body was sore. Like, your posture, because you're being supported by the Epsom salt solution, it's going to reinforce any bad posture you have. So oftentimes people float with their hands kind of up, and that helps pull your shoulders back and keep you more in line, in your spine and neck aligned. If you end up floating with your hands down by your side, what tends to happen is your shoulders want to roll forward. And so if you have already bad posture or anything like that, and you're in there for a really long time in a bad position for yourself and then fall asleep, you're going to wake up and you'll be like, ugh, I'm sore. And I think that may be what happened to him. So other than, maybe a little bit of body soreness from being in there for 7 hours, there's not really, that we're aware of, and from what we've heard in the industry, we've never heard of any negative effects of being in there for that long.
It's really interesting. It seems that there's been a shift in North American culture and being more open-minded to Eastern medicines and even more holistic forms of self-care, and even just that those self-love practices even. And it seemed to be, yoga was one of those early adapters, and people seem to like to try it. And even knowing that floating's been around this long now too, it's cool to see this shift. And I just wanted to know sort of how you see yourselves as being part of that, and even what practices sort of led you towards floating. Like, if you were always interested in this, or if it was something that just sort of sparked your interest as well.
I really like that you talked about self-love, because I often think that you find a lot of self-love in the float tank. And again, it's another hard thing to kind of put into words or explain, but I think often we lose ourselves in the world because we don't spend enough time with ourselves. We live in a world that glorifies busy and glorifies, I only need 5 hours of sleep a night, and just, we don't spend enough time in quiet and with ourselves, and we lose who we are because we forget to connect with ourselves. And, and it's so important to be able to spend that time. You know, like your friend said, I feel like I would get bored. He's probably someone who maybe needs to have the radio on all the time at home or the TV on in the background. There's just always constant noise because, you know, God forbid we should just like hang out with our own thoughts a little bit. And not saying anything negative to anybody at all. I think our society encourages that, and we don't even realize that we're getting lost. And that's what I find that happens often in the float environment is you get to reconnect with yourself and find that self-love again, because we're no good to anybody else in the world if we're not good to ourselves first. And we have a lot of people who come into flow with us because that's what's happened to them. I'm so busy taking care of my husband's sick or my children or my whatever, and I started to get resentful of the whole situation because I don't get anything for me. And when you kind of fill that cup again, and then you can go back out into the world and give. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the self-love there.
Yeah, and I think to the other part of your question, too, about, like, why now? You know, it's a question that we ask ourselves a lot is why now? Why are people, you know, more inclined to do things like floating and yoga and all these more holistic practices, or going out and seeking out products that don't have a bunch of chemicals in them, or eating better, or going vegan, or whatever the reason, whatever that specific person is kind of seeking. And it kind of, for us, you know, our name, FLOAT.Calm, like, it is that play on words, and it kind of, for us, made sense. With the technology background that I have, and I've always been a bit of a computer geek, you know, kind of relating how technology and the internet and social media is shaping society and things like that. It's important. It's important that we don't completely lose ourselves in the technology world. But at the same time, without this technology, you know, we have better access to information now than we ever have as a species. So people are now able to educate themselves on these alternate things, and they don't have to rely on, you know, very single sources of information like their general practitioner or their friend who's a chiropractor or whatever, people of authority, and they can go out and seek information and try to judge for themselves what will work for them. There's a double-edged sword there for sure, because you can have charlatans that try to take advantage of people and try to, you know, sell snake oil and stuff like that. And absolutely, there's risks in that as well. But I think that the reason why floating itself has started to, over the past 8 to 10 years, has started to regain in popularity is because of technology and because of social media, and because people are able to get messages out there quickly and easily, and then people are able to find them and consume them and make decisions for themselves, you know, and try to help themselves in their everyday life.
Yeah, I think technology is great in so many ways, but then the pendulum has a little bit too far in the wrong direction, and we need to bring ourselves back a little bit.
It's learning to use it as a tool.
Yes.
And also the meaningful use of it too. I mean, there are so many great aspects of it. The fact that we can educate each other and we can learn what's happening at all corners of the globe. But now it has sucked us in, and it becomes this addiction for people.
Yep.
And I know that you can sometimes sense yourself when you start to, you spend way too much time on your phone checking your feed, even though nothing's happening, or every other minute you go back to your phone. And so there's something about that time being alone, even floating especially, like being alone with your thoughts, but purposefully either relaxing, finding some sort of balance.
Yeah.
So if you are a busy type, somebody who works 9 to 5 or beyond, I mean, our world typically, the office hours don't always finish.
Yeah.
You're checking emails at night, or maybe there's some big project happening. So there's just this constant bombardment because people can reach you all the time. So finding that balance now seems more important than ever before. And it seems that there's also now a lot of different ways that people can do this. And this seems to be a tool that can be used as part of that as well, which is really interesting. The fact that there's all these different, I had a cool experience that I wanted to share too, because I I let my mind go blank, and all of a sudden I had some wisdom come up. I thought about sort of the catastrophes that have happened in my life. And so everybody has hardship. Everybody goes through some difficult things, difficult times. And I came out with the wisdom that your beautiful catastrophe, I'll try and say it better, your beautiful catastrophes lead you to your bliss.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, if I left with nothing else but that wisdom, and it's even accepting those things that you've been through, and those quote unquote negative things that maybe lead you down a dark path, for lack of a better term, or even just a path away from yourself. There is that way back, and it also can lead you to a place where you need to be, which, yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors, Glennon Doyle, she's fantastic. She always says that life is brutal and beautiful at the same time, and so she always says life is brutal. And I often feel that people that have been through some of the darkest times often end up being some of my most favorite people, because they come out of it so much better versions of themselves with so much more self-awareness and yeah, they're some of the deepest people often. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
The wisdom. That wisdom word that you said, yeah, it's interesting. And like with technology, I always look at technology, like you said, it's a tool. It's pretty agnostic. It doesn't care. Your computer's going to sit there. If you don't touch it, it's still going to sit there. It's not going to do anything. And a float tank is just another form of technology. It's just a technology. It's a tool. And you can use that tool in different ways. I use it a lot personally for exploring ideas and solutions to problems. And like you said, when you sit and do nothing, it's amazing kind of what stuff comes up without trying. And so when I describe this to people who ask me, like, how much do you float? What do you use a float tank for? And I describe it. I use it a lot like a tool to help problem solve and find solutions. And I don't try hard to do it. I just simply have an idea or a problem that I'm trying to solve, and I just plant it and go in and try to forget about it. And ultimately, those solutions or wisdom or whatever you want to call it, they bubble up out of the subconscious or out of, I don't know where they come up. And that's what's really cool about it, because you get out of the float tank, and for me, I'm like, oftentimes I'll just sit and I'll just write for like 20 minutes, just trying to barf out everything that kind of came up during that float. And it doesn't happen every time, but when it does happen, it can come like a tidal wave, and you're like, I think
You're such the ideas guy in the tank. He comes out and I'm always like, did you solve world hunger today?
But it's so great. It's a really unique environment for problem solving. And, there's some universities now that have installed float tanks in like their locker rooms and stuff like that. University of Ohio, I believe it is. They've started floating their women's soccer team, specifically their women's soccer team, because women are more susceptible to social stresses and peer pressure, and they're more likely to like succumb to the stresses of having, being a full-time university student, which is stressful enough, and then also being a very high-level athlete. And so they started floating them and then taking blood samples and doing blood cortisol, your stress hormone tests, and they found that the subgroup of women that were floating had lower cortisol levels, lower stress, and then they correlate that to their grades. They have better grades, they have lower dropout rates, their athletic performance is better, and it's really cool that something so simple as a float tank can offer people just like literally a better kind of quality of life from just taking that time to sit and do nothing.
So is there a time you wish you had this as a tool in your life that you didn't? So floating and sensory deprivation as a tool that you could use in life?
Wish I had it a long time ago, but I think, everything in hindsight,
Everything in its time.
Everything
for
in
a
its
reason.
time for a reason, like I don't think
Yeah.
if it would have come up earlier in my life, probably wouldn't have been in a position to actually
Or be ready for
or
it.
be ready for it. You change when you grow and you get older and your interests evolve and I don't think I probably when I was 20, if I would have heard about it or whatever, I probably would have thought it was stupid.
You may have been
I would have been
going
like-
blindfolded into the situation, not knowing, and creating a hot mess for yourself.
That or I just would have been hypercritical of it. Myself, I'm always a very, like Leah says, like it's important to ask questions and make sure that you're not being sucked into something that is maybe too hippy dippy or a bit there's no foundation to it, and I probably wouldn't have been ready for it myself. I'm really happy that we found floating and that we're able to create a place that offers it to people. It's really a huge privilege, and I think just the more stories that we pick up over the years of our floaters and they come in, it just becomes that much more rewarding, because then we can share those stories with other people, then they can relate to them, because I think that's that's something that people need, is they need something to relate to, and we are not, I think one of the challenges with floating is it's perception, right? Everything is perception, and perception of it being this hippy dippy thing, this new agey woo woo whatever thing, and that's not us at all. We're not hippy dippy. We're not woo woo. Have we had meditation and yoga practices in the past? For sure. Do I consider those things hippy dippy? No, because I'm going to point to the science that people have done and the studies that they've done to show empirically that these things are not just hippy dippy woo. There's actually long stemming benefits from things like mindfulness and stuff like that.
Sure.
So I'm always one to try to root and ground things in science. I'm very much, that's just how my brain works. I have trouble I have trouble just believing in things just purely on what one person says, or faith, or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's important that people do take up a practice of questioning things, so that they can.
It seems like you guys are very transparent too with it, and it's not like you're hiding anything. And it's like science is against this or anything. Like the proof is right in the front of your shop, right? There's that study right there if you want to read into it.
That's the newest one too, yeah. And there's I got a
Access
whole
from early 2018, right?
Yeah, it's just from February, and that's specifically on the anxiety reducing effects, and that's a short-term study. So it was done. They took 50 anxious participants. This is done, by the way, at a center called LIBOR, the Laureate Institute for Brain Research in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they've created what they call their float lab there. So they have 2 big custom-made float tanks with a bunch of monitoring equipment that they can monitor. They have an fMRI, functional, brain imaging machine down the hall that they have access to. They have a wireless EEG head mount machine so they can measure your brain waves. They have a wireless blood pressure cuff. They have a wireless heart rate variability measuring device. And they've been doing research for about almost 4 years now. We've been to the Float conference 5 times, and 5 times in 6 years, because we missed 1 year. And Dr. Justin Feinstein, who's the lead doctor at this research center, has been using all this equipment and designing studies with some other doctors there on different things. He himself specializes in anxiety disorders, so that's what the first study was about. And it was 50 anxious participants. They all went for a single session, and they did a standardized test that psychologists use to measure anxiety levels. They did it before and then after. And they saw there wasn't one person out of the 50 that didn't see a dramatic decrease in the anxiety level after a single session. And then in the study, it goes into some of the physiological functions that were, your heart rate variability increases, which is a good sign of how your heart is able to compensate for your environment and what you're physically going through. It showed their brain waves and all this really interesting stuff. And through that study, they now got some funding from the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the States, to do a more longitudinal study on the anxiety reducing effects that this environment can have on a person, which is awesome because every float center owner out there has got stories like ours where they have people who come in and they're so nervous, so anxious about life. They can't even make eye contact with you when you're talking with them. They're just like in a shell of themselves. And they go in after one session and it's like a different person comes out of that float tank. They're all chatty. They're making all the eye contact. Giggles.
Yeah.
They're
and sometimes
like,
I wonder if they even realize the 180 that they've done. It's phenomenal to see.
yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's really cool, and we're really privileged that we get to offer this to people, and I think the benefits of something like this are almost to quote kind of Joe Rogan, he does a really good job at describing floating. And if float tanks were like this ride at Disney where they strapped you in and they told you they were going to shoot you to the center of the universe,
Consciousness.
yeah, or the center of your consciousness, that the line would be a mile long. And because it's this simple, kind of strange, almost scary, device that isn't designed in a way that reduces stimulus coming in to, as close to nothing as possible, it has there's a bit of a barrier there for a lot of people to kind of get over.
When I got into the tank and once I started laying there, it almost felt like my knee depressurized. So it kind of just relaxed. Mm-hmm. And when I got out, I felt like I was walking better. Is there a lot of science to back up the physical benefits of floating?
There is, there's a really small study, I can't remember what university it was, where they were doing, what is it called? Lactic acid in your blood. So they were taking athletes and they were taking blood draws and doing lactic acid measurements before and after float sessions. And they showed that going into a float tank can reduce lactic acid in the blood and in turn can decrease recovery time for things like muscles and stuff that, if you're somebody who works out or whatever, you're building up a lot of lactic acid in your muscles, you're a trainer, right?
Yeah.
So it will help people decrease recovery time. Anecdotally, we can also say that too, because we do have a lot of athletes that come into us specifically for the physical relief that they can get and to decrease their recovery time.
And chronic pain.
But I was going to say chronic pain is probably, it's one of the big chunks of people that come in to see us.
100%.
And with your knee, I don't know exactly, that could be a combination of that, in the float world, they call it the anti-gravity effect. Obviously, you can't get away from gravity on Earth, but in a float tank, you feel kind of weightless, and it's a really neat sensation because your body weight's spread out over the surface of the solution, and so that can help your joints decompress over that time that you're in there. And by doing that, you're going to get some better blood circulation in there. If there's inflammation that's causing issues, it's going to help clear some of that stuff out faster. And then the Epsom salt with that magnesium sulfate, it's going to help some of those supporting muscles and stuff around there, or compensating muscles. If you're somebody who has an injury, oftentimes you'll have an injury on one side of your body and then you'll overcompensate it with the other and you'll end up messing up the other side. It will help some of those compensating and other muscles relax. And this is why people have been having Epsom salt baths for forever, and they still do, because it tends to help your muscles relax. And so a float tank is the ultimate Epsom salt.
I feel like it would be a huge benefit for a lot of people who have office jobs, for example, who have these crazy postural problems developed over years and years of sitting at a desk, right?
100%. I was a computer guy. I worked in an office for almost 15 years. And my first float, I had a wicked headache the night of my first float because, and we say to this day, it's I was fighting the float. I was not, I'm not somebody who can just go into a swimming pool or a lake and just lay back and relax and float on my back effortlessly. It's a strange sensation and my butt sinks and I'm done. In a float tank, that's just not possible. So my first float, I probably unconsciously didn't fully trust that the solution would support my body and my head. So I was holding tension in my neck for the whole session. And as a result, I had a wicked headache that night. And so this is a very common thing.
Well, I wouldn't say
have.
it's common that people have headaches
No,
afterwards.
it's a very common thing that your first float, it's very it's a strange sensation.
Yeah, especially if you're not used to the sensation of being able to float like you. You know, like you said, not having faith that the water is going to support you completely, and just realizing that you just need to let your head go and you're totally fine. But
Yeah.
that's a weird thing for people to do if they've never been able to float before. So
Yeah, it's interesting, like the physical benefits, and this it kind of comes back to your point, Riley, like about people will come into float for different reasons. One of them is the physical benefit, whether it's they've been suffering from a chronic pain, whether it's from injury, fibromyalgia, like a nerve issue. We've had guests as young as like 12 who've had multiple spinal surgeries come in to get away from gravity because they're in just constant chronic pain all the time. And then what happens a lot is over time, they will use the float tank as a tool to help manage their pain, or in some cases, depending on the ailment. I'm thinking of the one lady there who had Bell's palsy.
yes,
And so she had, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Bell's palsy, it's a neurological issue where half your face becomes paralyzed and it can be very painful. She was coming in like every day for multiple weeks. And she was able to, I wouldn't say like floating wasn't the only thing she was doing. She was also taking medication and stuff like that of some kind. But her friends would ask her, like, you're looking so much better. What are you doing? And she was like, I'm just floating, man. I'm just doing the float. That's all I'm doing. And what happens is people who have a acute issue with pain, they'll end up kind of transitioning out of their coming into floating for pain relief, and they'll now come into float for different reasons. And oftentimes people tend to have this interesting arc in their float practice where it goes from treating a very acute thing like anxiety, pain, and it almost ends up turning into a spiritual practice. It's very interesting. And you know, we talk about this all the time. I'm like, you know, would I consider myself a religious person? No. Would I consider myself a spiritual person? Probably. And probably a lot more than I was 10 years ago. And without a doubt, it's because of a float tank. And when you explain that to people, it's a really difficult thing to conceptualize for them. Because when you're in there, and you said it, and that was not words that we said that you repeated, but those words that you said are pretty much the exact same thing I've said before, is that you get this interesting connected feeling when you're in a float tank. You feel connected with everybody and everything, even though you are not being connected with anything. And it's really interesting how that happens, and I can't explain it. I can't explain the reason why, but it's something that happens all the time for our guests. And some people do have they'll describe it as feeling like out-of-body experiences. What is that? Can science explain that? Nope. That is the phenomenology of the float experience. It's unique to that person, and I can't deny that they're having that experience. They say they're having it. I'm like, then they did. Then you're having it. Yeah.
That woman that had Bell's palsy. And I remember her, and one of the most beautiful things about that experience is, you know, the thing that upset her the most, she ended up off on disability off work because she just, she couldn't work anymore, and that took her to a dark place. And she said the thing that she missed most was her smile because, you know, like you said, like half of her face was paralyzed, and through floating pretty much every day or every second day for a period of time, I physically got to watch her smile come back. And it was just so beautiful to see because she just started getting better and better and better. And I love that story because you physically got to see the change in someone because of what she specifically was dealing with. And to speak to your comment too about floating for people who work in office environments. We actually have a blog post on our website specifically about that, floating for people who work in the office space. Because we're not our bodies aren't meant to sit for 8+ hours a day. It's kind of like goes against everything.
It's unfortunate if that's the case.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So and you've improved a lot, your body, just from not being in that situation anymore and floating all the time as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It shows the interconnectivity. Even the holistic approach seems to be gaining steam, and it shows that a lot of these examples, whether it's Jayse or the Bell's palsy person that's come in, or even those personal journeys, it shows that there is an interconnectivity about the holistic wellness of a person. So the physical can be tied to the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual as well. And that's very much how I've started to weigh things in my life and the world. It just seems to be those things in the different realms seem to affect everything, and it's all this interconnected. Whatever you are, that's interconnected, and so it makes sense that when you become more connected to yourself and maybe get to accept the pain a little bit more, or sort through some of the emotional things tied to it, or even intellectually sort through problems that are happening surrounding it, that spiritually you're able to feel better, you're able to smile again, you're able to feel more fully yourself, even in those cases where maybe it's something that's affected you long term or will continue to affect you long term. But if you're able to accept where you are, again, going back to the same point, but when you're able to accept what you're going through, those feelings, those emotions, you can get back to that place where you feel fulfilled and you feel happy again, which shows just it's great to see that type of progress and the fact that this can have that effect on people.
Yeah, all those different pillars you're talking about, your physical, your mental, your spiritual, like they're all different legs of our chair if you think about it that way. And, if we aren't balanced, our chair is not going to stand up properly. It's not going to support us properly. It's going to be a hot mess, right? So it's important to kind of give attention to all those different legs of our chair and to give attention to them and make sure that they're balanced out.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and
I
way
like
to
it.
look at it. It's I think that people can relate to that in terms of, an unsturdy chair is going to fall. So I don't think that we're all that different from that too.
Yeah.
I did want to know if there's any books that have helped you along the way, either in floating or in terms of life.
We do have the Book of Floating at the center. It's a fantastic book written by Michael Hutchinson.
Michael Hutchinson.
Not the goalie?
Not the goalie, no. Good call, though. I am familiar with that.
And it's a great book as well. It dives into kind of what's going on inside of us when we're in the float environment in different ways and different aspects. And so it's a really great read.
Yeah, it pulls in a little bit of science that was done at the time, because it was, I think, I should know the exact publishing date, but it was in the 80s. And so there was some legit scientific work that had been done, but it also talks about some of the more ethereal kind of things that are hard to pin down to like empirical data and things like that. And it's really easy to read because it was written by a journalist. He wanted to do an article for, I think it was like either the New York Times or something, on floating. And he started to this is in the 80s because it was in New York. And he started to go around to these little float centers that had started popping up. And he just kind of got immersed in the community. And he's like, holy man, this is really cool. And so he just gathered so much information, he decided to write a whole book about it. So that's a good one as far as floating goes to learn about. I don't know if there's other books that you wanted to mention.
Well, I like anything by Brené Brown. That's just kind of, she really kind of helps people work through their own stuff and give you different ways to question yourself. As I mentioned, Glennon Doyle before, her book Love Warrior is awesome. I think she's fantastic. Those are the books that I tend to like to read. What about you?
I definitely, the one that comes to mind immediately for whatever reason is Stealing Fire, which is just about the flow state that people can achieve. And it's just fascinating, the more that we learn about physics and the brain and stuff like that, how you can draw these very interesting parallels to almost spiritual practices. And I really like linking the two things together, that kind of left brain, right brain, spiritual and scientific world. I think the more that we learn just as a species about that stuff, I think it's showing us that we do have to have that balance in our lives. We can't just be completely science brain or completely hippie woo spiritual brain. Like there has to be some correlation in order for us to kind of make progress. That one immediately comes to mind. I don't know why. It was an okay book. I did like it. Trying to think of some other ones that I really like.
I keep meaning to read Brene Brown's Daring Greatly.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those ones that
So
I
good.
haven't got around to yet, but I will in the very near future.
She's so great. I sit with her books with sticky notes and a highlighter and just like have at it. And then I'll like, oh, dude, I've got to read you this part. Oh, dude, I've got to read you this part. And it's just like you just sit there and it just kind of blows your mind, all the stuff that, it just makes you sit and just think about. The thing I love about her is she brings her own story to the table and she's not afraid to admit her own hot messes and how she kind of, in a situation, maybe she dealt with it this way when she knows she should do this, but this is her go-to way of kind of behaving in life and just challenging her own self and trying to change those behaviors in herself, and which makes it super relatable. I think if you approach a topic that you've already achieved greatness in that topic, people aren't going to listen to you because they'll never get there. But if you approach a topic talking about your own hot messes, people are down like a clown with that stuff, hey?
Yeah.
Relatability.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
So, along the same lines, what is the biggest obstacle you've either had to overcome with the business or yourselves individually?
I think just from the business standpoint, like we're first-time business owners, and I think that just brings its own challenges just in learning and stuff like that. Being a female business owner is also brought on different challenges that I maybe wasn't expecting, and maybe some of them I give to myself just as a societal kind of dictated behavior, and some of them have kind of, jumped out and grabbed me, things I wasn't expecting, but as far as, just floating in general, just the education piece and helping people get past themselves, I think,
Helping people to see the barriers and the comfort zone that they're creating around them in a way that is like, loving and accepting, but at the same time challenging them without being offensive. It really is that can be a challenge sometimes.
I just think like if everybody in the world floated on a regular basis, how much more calm and relaxed
and accepting of
we
each
would
other.
be. Absolutely. And wouldn't that be phenomenal?
Yeah, like one of our, underlying philosophies of our business and our mission, or more our vision, I guess, that we had kind of going into this world of owning a float center and where that takes us is, as long as we are, helping people be more compassionate people in the world, then we're doing our job. That's kind of like the overarching thing, and
not just with other people, but also with themselves.
exactly, and being okay with your flaws and all those, everything that makes each of us unique, and those things, I think Leah may have said it before, but the most interesting people are the ones that have the flaws and they have the edges, the rough edges on them, and those are often the most interesting people that have the most the broadest perspective, and they're able to offer the most, and it's just it's really fun to get to know some of those people for sure.
Yeah.
I also wanted to know if you had any advice for somebody wanting to make a positive change in their life. What would you say to them?
I would say whatever you're going to do, make sure you can make it sustainable and you can stick to it. Start small. If you want to change your eating habits, you want to eat less crap or less meat or whatever, or you have friends that are going vegan and you're vegetarian or whatever it is, just do 1 day a week to begin. Move and work your way from there. But whatever you do, don't just go all out, because you're gonna especially with things like physical fitness and working out, you're going to get so sore. You're either going to make yourself sick or you're going to be like, what did I do? And now I'm injured or hurt.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, you're the man to talk to about this, not me.
But you're right. 0 to 100 results in failure
Yeah,
most of the time.
small attainable things, and then celebrate those
Yeah.
little milestones, because
Yeah.
the little milestones are what make up the big ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you hope people will achieve during their time floating?
I think just a better connection with themselves and whatever that is that they need, because we're all different, right? And I think that that's kind of, what the Float Center does. It gives people the gift of themselves back to themselves. And we're disconnected in different ways from ourselves. And so I think that would be what I would say.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I always tell people not to go in with huge expectations, especially their first few floats. Your first float is rarely your best float. Sometimes it's a hot mess. Sometimes you're busy, you're bouncing off the walls, and you're like, I'm not sure I like this or I can't do this, and just that, like Leah says, that self-realization of this is how my body and my mind experience life in general. It's just when you're in a float tank, it's kind of magnified because there's nothing coming in. And so people like to make excuses, or they like to get angry, almost like that we did something to them or that the float tank did something. And it's like the float tank's job is to do nothing.
It's a mirror to yourself.
And
Yeah.
everything that happens in there is a product of what's happening in your mind. And so for people to have some kind of realization that they have some control over their own life, their behavior, their moods, their happiness, I think that is what I want people to ultimately get to, is that they have some level of control over themselves. You can't control what everybody in your life is doing or what's going on in the world around you. The only thing you have some control over is your own person, and the float tank is like a little amplifier that kind of makes you really aware, because it turns the volume up a little bit on what's going on inside your head and inside your person.
And like you said, not going in with expectations. We had someone tell us recently that, way back, they had brought a friend in with them for their first float. Someone who had been floating with us regularly brought a friend in, and his friend came out of his float and he was really frustrated because he didn't have any hallucinations. And I think that that's totally hilarious, because it's almost goes to speaking to our, Disneyland way that we kind of approach life. Like there's supposed to be the big fireworks at the end, and that's not the point. And, some people do have hallucinations, absolutely. And the most hilarious and best part of that is that you can't force those things in. The whole thing is those things come when you're in letting go. And if you spend your whole float working to hallucinate, like, you're guaranteeing that it's not going to happen, and that you came out frustrated, I just think you're missing the point altogether. So yeah, it's all just in the hardest thing sometimes is letting go, and that's the art of it all, right?
Yeah.
I found it was an advanced form of meditation. And funny enough, when you were talking, I thought of how tarot has been that in my own life. So it's something that a practice I've only done for about a year, but similarly, you said the mirror to the self, or the
To
mind.
yourself, yeah.
To
Yeah.
the mind is what you said. And tarot, the one that I use, is the mirror to the soul. So it's very much, it's that same thing. It's putting cards, and it's just really meditative and reading into your own life. And so it's cool to see that there's different ways of attaining the same state of self-awareness, and just realizing maybe it's your place in that moment, maybe it's that place where you're trying to get to, maybe it's all of that encapsulated in one. But yeah, I saw the juxtaposition, and it's funny because it's another thing that I didn't see previous to that too. So finally, I wanted to know what the main goal you hope to achieve with FLOAT.COM, and are you on track to achieving it?
I think the main goal,
Or one of the many.
one of the many. I think, like I was saying before, like one kind of our overarching vision is, to make people more compassionate in the world to others, themselves, the environment,
Animals.
things like that. Animals. That I would say is definitely an overarching goal, and it's that's a really abstract thing. Like that's a hard thing to measure. Coming in the business world, everybody wants to measure everything and turn everything into a metric that you can measure your past performance against. And for us, that's just more of a compass. It just kind of keeps us pointed, hopefully in the right direction. And in the many, many chats we've had with, a lot of our guests, I think I feel it's more of probably a feeling kind of measurement I feel like we're achieving some of that goal slowly but surely, whether it's just a little anecdotal story about somebody being like, I got on my float and, I went and got in my car and somebody cut me off and I was like, oh, that's fine.
Wasn't even mad
about it. It was
so relaxed. I didn't even realize.
Yeah. And if you can just make those little changes that carry with people, throughout their day and that they can then reflect back on, then I think you're doing something.
Doing something
You're
good.
doing something good.
As we said earlier, we're just celebrating our 4th anniversary, and we're just about to start our 4th journal at the center. So we have a journal out at the center that people can, if they want to share about their float experiences, they can share, and it's great because it allows people to share, but it also gives people an opportunity to read other people's experiences. And so far, we've have 3 completely full journals. We're about to start our 4th. So as far as being able to measure if we've been able to impact people's lives, I think
that's a good yardstick. I like that.
I think
the journals are really cool.
Yeah.
And I always joke that, some people think they're philosophers coming out of a float because some of the stuff you read in those journals, you're like,
whoa.
They're like these,
Yeah.
head exploding, insights that some people have, and some of them are really powerful. We've had people read them and start crying. We've had people walk into a float room and start crying.
Yeah.
One of our very first guests, our very first guest ever was 2 days before we were open. And this is a very interesting story. We were literally, there's tools all over the place. We're like trying to get the place set up. It's the 11th hour. It's just nuts. And we just, I think the day before, got our float tanks filled with, the Epsom salt solution. And they were, I think we maybe floated once to test them out, but everything is, very raw and crude. And we're in the front area and we hear a knock on the window. And there's a woman there, and she's like, "Oh my God, are you guys open?"
No, what she had said is, do you guys have those sensory deprivation tanks? Like I tried one years ago when I was in Edmonton or something like that, and I said, "Yeah, that's what we do here." And she's like, "Can I come and float?" And she had just taken her car across the street to Cal Tire. She had a week long of hot messes that led up to.
It was
everything.
Right, was it right around the Ebola scare there in Africa? And she works in that. She has anyway. She's involved in the lab, and she had a really stressful week.
Just a lot of that, and like her work life and some personal things as well. And she was just feeling like a bit of a hot mess. And I told her, I said, we're actually not even open yet for business. I said, but like, if you're okay with coming in and there's tools all over the place and all that kind of stuff, then I think we can get you in for a float. She goes, I can't even tell you how much I need this and how much it would mean to me. So we brought her in, and Brad took her back for her float, and as soon as she walked into the float room, she just started crying because she just needed it so bad, and she was so grateful and excited to be there. And she came out just this completely like new version of herself, and she wrote a haiku on our chalkboard wall, and that's become like her signature thing that she does. And ironically, she's in for float this evening, and she's been floating with us ever since. Wow. And every time she comes in, she's a very creative person, and she's an artist, she's a musician, and she always writes a post-float haiku on our chalkboard walls.
It's very interesting that she's actually in floating tonight.
Yeah, so our very first guest was before we were even open, so I think that's kind of funny.
That's fantastic, and I think that kind of speaks to itself that you've had someone come before you were even open and they're still going. this day.
And it was great for us too. I think that fed us as much as it fed her, because when you're in the 11th hour and you're like, good God, I could use a float, and you can't even float yet because you're not open. Like,
and you've invested, a huge part of yourself and your savings and everything
and you're
into
tired,
this thing, and you're like, I hope this works.
And it just kind of helped revitalize all the reasons why we were doing what we were doing. And so it was really the best thing that could have happened probably for both of us, so that when we did, like 2 days later, have our opening day, like we were just ready for it.
Felt good.
In all other
ready.
capacities, for sure.
You can call it chance, but it's really cool to see how sometimes the universe or whatever powers that be sort of answer that, and so that chaos of opening a business, but then having that rewarding experience of, well, for that woman, of having the float, and then for you seeing her and how it transformed her and transformed her days. So that's amazing to have that as part of your story and experience too. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So to conclude, I did want to know where we can find FLOAT.com and what you would like to share with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, for sure. So like you said, we're on Pembina Highway, 337 Pembina Highway, about 3 blocks down from Corden Avenue. We have 5 float tanks at our center, so we always encourage people book with a friend. It's a lot of fun. You're in your own separate room, but because we are so close to Corden and Osborne, go out for a drink or dinner afterwards. We have a lot of information on our website, which is FLOAT.Calm. That's FLOAT.Calm. And all of our social media channels are Facebook and Instagram. We're really active on. And for anybody who's listening too, if they want to get 10% off their first float session too, use the discount code BeTheChange, and they can use that in our online store or in the shop, whatever works for them, and they can come in and get a discount on their first float.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and we'll post links on the video as well to that too. And as always, we're Be The Change. You can find us on social media at Be The Change YPS. If you ever have anything for us, whether it's information or potential guests, you can email us at info@bethechangeYPS.com. Not the old one with a bunch of dots before that, and in between the words, info@bethechangeYPS.com. I can't think of any announcements. I may have one soon because I think I'm going to donate all my hair to cancer wigs at the end of the year.
Riley without long hair?
Riley without long hair. It's been a long process.
I can't
but
picture
Turn
it
that
anymore.
into a hashtag Riley without long hair.
hashtag Riley without long hair. Subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you're listening or viewing this podcast. And just closing thoughts, I really wanted to thank you two for joining us and for the float experience. It was awesome to just have that release, but it's even better to have you here and have this conversation and just get to know more about yourselves and your story and just the power of floating and just meeting like-minded people that want to help people and are having that impact on the world. It's awesome.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
And I really look forward to my next float, especially after the anxiety around it is all gone. And I've experienced
Absolutely.
one for sure.
That's the first
thank you
float
guys.
jitters are normal.
Once you know what to expect, now you can start peeling the onion layers away and just getting deeper into it.
So once again, thank you, Leah and Brad. Bye, listeners, viewers.
Take care.